The Ukraine National Anti-Doping Agency has been giving their athletes prior warning of drug tests since about 2012. Now, we currently know about this because it was reported on Inside the Games, an article written by Mike Rowbottom, which is a sensational name, and he's put forward this really great piece talking about Operation Hercules, which was launched back in 2019 as a way to try and understand and uncover some of what was going on within Ukraine and their drug testing. Now, it's important to mention that Operation Hercules was focused on athletics, not specifically weightlifting. The report doesn't mention weightlifting outright, but at the same time it also doesn't not mention weightlifting. It's been posted around in various weightlifting forums, I've been sent it, so I think it's probably worth us sort of covering just as a weightlifting-esque story. So as we can see on the article, it says the NADC, which somehow stands for Ukraine Anti-Doping Agency, has been giving athletes this prior notice of these what should be unexpected out of competition tests. Now, it's always been the case that drug testing should be totally, and the athlete should be completely unaware of it. Having any kind of in advance notice is massively unfair. Obviously, the half-life of some of these compounds, these PEDs that various athletes are using, require very little time to get totally out of the body, or at least be undetectable or within reasonable levels when they get tested. So Operation Hercules has uncovered evidence to suggest that since 2012, the NADC has conducted unjustified advanced notice sample collections, arranging to test athletes, including groups of athletes, by appointment at the NADC offices. This report has amassed compelling evidence to suggest that in 2021, the NADC knowingly reported at least 6 in-competition samples as out-of-competition samples, in contravention of various articles of the World Anti-Doping Code. So this is a problem also for various reasons. So 6 in-competition tests, putting them as out-of-competition tests. We know that out of competition, if an athlete is doping, they're likely to be doping to higher levels, taking higher doses of various compounds, whereas in competition, obviously athletes tend to cycle off. There's still corruption, there's still bribery, there's still just an exchange of money potentially, but certainly athletes are a little bit less egregious with the amount of drugs that they might be using if they are doped up. So there's the fact that they're getting away with looking like they're cleaner out of competition. Then there's also the fact that there are different rules in terms of what you can take in competition versus out. There are actually PEDs that you're not allowed to take in competition that you can out, and vice versa, and so the switching of those has a big impact. And also, we're talking about 1 to 2% at the top. We're talking about 0.1% of an improvement that you can gain from a substance you're going to take if you can get away with it in a lot of these situations. And so just these very small things, these switches, make a big difference. So Operation Hercules shows that NADC was engaged in the practice of telephoning athletes or reaching out to these athletes through their coaches to request their attendance at the NADC the following day. And then this is quite crazy. It was saying that there are times when an entire discipline, so entire sport of the national team would be present at the NADC awaiting testing. They'd all been told the day before. All right, we've got a helicopter going overhead. Perhaps it's Ukrainian. Okay, so this is now interesting. It's talking about these 6 samples, not just the prior warning, but the 6 in competition that were labelled as out of competition. That's partly due to, and there's a quote here, it says, the evidence suggests that samples were misreported under instruction and for the purposes of meeting the minimum number of out-of-competition tests required prior to attending the Tokyo Olympics. So prior to the Olympics, there was a certain number of times that you would have to be tested. Obviously, if you weren't tested in those out-of-competition times, how useful it would be to take your in-competition tests and just say that they're out of competition and bulk that number from, say, 2 to 5 to make it look like you were routinely tested. So just generally, you can see the article, you can read it in full depth if you want to. I'll put the link down below. Huge shout out once again to Inside the Games. They are phenomenal at getting this content. It's just interesting me once again that, Russians were passing tests through, or samples through holes in the wall. Dmitry Chumak, who happened to have been Ukrainian, supposedly was bribing the WADA official who was trying to test him. And I love the fact that it always makes me laugh that Owen from Seek always said that he would get this second-hand level of embarrassment or cringe just from imagining Chumak trying to hand over this bribe and the WADA representative just being like, no, we don't do that. Just so awkward. Then there's, these stories of Abajev and the Bulgarians back in the day, and they would get calls from the Bulgarian anti-doping agency saying WADA's on their way, and they would literally be met at the border by various people who would hold up WADA with guns, with threats, making sure that the Bulgarian national team could drive to another training camp. There are stories of WADA trying to enter Bulgaria over mountains, trying to get in undetected so that they could actually test the Bulgarian athletes. There are just all of these stories about how this works. It's not slick. It's always muddled up. It's always got this sort of human error that gets involved, and that's how people get found out. But I think we tend to think that it's this creation of incredible PEDs that are undetectable, and sometimes it is. And you can see, nicely when you look at the 100-meter times over the years, it goes up, comes down, goes up, comes down. Or in fact, I should say it goes down as people take more and more drugs. Then the testers find out what it is they're testing, and it goes back up. It just does this little zigzag seesaw thing. And in weightlifting, I think it's probably quite similar. And I think that what we're seeing here with Ukraine, probably seems to be the most simple way of doing it. I can imagine that there are some countries who will remain unnamed, because I don't like calling out countries or athletes who haven't been caught doing anything. I really don't think that that's fair. But a lot of these countries who we wonder, how are they passing tests? What are they doing? I think it might be as simple as this, that their governing testing body just warns them. It's on their side, it's not on WADA's side. It gives them the one-day warning. And when half-lives are as short as they are, one-day warning allows you to just microdose with tiny amounts of compounds that might enhance your performance to some degree. And we're talking about 1 to 2% differences over other countries. When you look at who you might consider to be the best clean nation versus the best nation, there's only a couple percent in it. And I think that's maybe what we're looking at, especially when we know that back in the 80s, when drug use was at its highest, if we look at Seoul, Korea, 1988, and we see these 250.5 kilo clean and jerks by 110 kilo Zakharevich, all of these sorts of absurd numbers that we would see, that's when drug use was much more egregious. Weightlifters now aren't lifting, other than Lasha, anything particularly close to that. I mean, 73 kilo Shi Ziyong is lifting under 200 kilos. 75 kilo Varbanov was lifting 215 kilos. There's a big difference between what we are lifting now and what they are lifting then. We're much closer to what you might consider the natural limit now. Not because the athletes are natural, but because they're not taking, vials and vials of PEDs. They're able to just maybe microdose a little bit, get a warning 24 hours beforehand, and then go in and then get drug tested and then come out clean. I think that's probably much more likely to be how this is happening. Anyway, great reporting from Inside the Games. Huge thank you to Mike Rowbottom for putting this article up. And also, if you're wondering why I've done a few shorter news pieces, a few people messaged and said, instead of putting out the 30-minute news piece where you just go through everything, do individual stories. And so I'm doing that, and I'll see what response I get. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Make sure you subscribe for more weightlifting news.